Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, wir freuen uns wieder einmal sehr, Sie im Namen des Schweizerischen Instituts für Auslandforschung hier im Studio des Centers for Global Dialogue der Swiss Re in Rüschlikon begrüßen zu dürfen. Wir danken wie immer für die außerordentlich attraktive Gastfreundschaft. Der Livestream gilt einem spannenden Thema und selbstverständlich auch einem überaus spannenden Gesprächspartner. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Swiss Institute of International Studies, we are delighted to welcome you once again to the Swiss Re Center for Global Dialogue in Rüschlikon, nearby Zurich. Thank you for this extraordinary hospitality to our friends from Swiss Re. My name is Martin Meyer. I'm the managing director of the Institute. As always, ladies and gentlemen, the live stream is dedicated to an interesting topic and, of course, a highly inspiring dialogue partner. I'm particularly pleased to welcome Mr. Bill Emmott, the former long-standing editor-in-chief of The Economist, who has positioned himself as an extremely competent and versatile analyst of current world affairs. Please give Bill a huge hand.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you indeed, Bill, very much for taking the time to discuss important issues of European and also, of course, global politics here with us in the studio. This already outlines the main features of our topic, world disorder. The fact that we are living in difficult, even dangerous times no longer needs to be explained. Wars, geopolitical shifts, and other uncertainties characterize events. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has plunged the global peace order into a serious crisis. And this applies also, mutatis mutandis, to the conflict in the Middle East. Added to this are the desires that China is continuing to fuel regarding Taiwan, so that a highly dangerous theater of war is also possible there, far beyond the Pacific region. What can be done to counter such threats? This is a concern for all responsible contemporaries and, of course, especially for politicians in the West. It is the Western community of values that should be able to position itself anew and possibly more strongly against authoritarian and even totalitarian temptations. However, it should be said straight away that there is still a great deal to be done here, and the determination to recognize the problems and act accordingly has so far been limited, to put it diplomatically. We want to discuss all of this in a round of 45 minutes here on stage, and afterwards, ladies and gentlemen, you will have the opportunity to put your own questions to Bill Emmott here in the studio, but also, as always, over the internet. And now, again, thank you for being here, and we go into medias res. To start the discussion, some basic considerations. Has there ever been a global political situation, Bill, since the end of the Second World War that was as dangerous as we have it today, if we disregard, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was, however, more clearly organized by its bipolarity?
Well, I think that we always think more warmly about the past than the past deserves. And I do think that there have been dangerous times in the Cold War period. If we think of the fact that we had the Korean War, we had the Vietnam War, surrounding the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you like, if we think we had all of these issues with the missiles in Europe and so on. I don't think we should pretend that we haven't been in this kind of situation before, and we can think of several wars between Israel and its neighbors in that period as well. So the real shock to us is that the post-1990 period seemed to be one in which we had a certain amount more stability, and in particular, an absence of superpower competition.
Exactly.
That's the real innovation. Now, going back in history, great power competition is the norm. We are back in normal times. It's just that we thought that post-Cold War we might be in a long abnormal period of, if you like, some stability with regard to this. But now, let's not kid ourselves, we are in a period of great power competition, of which I think the key characteristic is that we have great powers, but all of them are fragile, weak, flawed in some quite significant way. And that, to me, is some of the danger, that actually China, Russia, the United States, to leave the others aside, are all actually problematic superpowers.
Makes it even more dangerous by the situation you just described, of course. Looking back to 1989, Annus Mirabilis, and the implosion of the Soviet Union, we were very optimistic, way too optimistic. Why was that?
Well, it was an enormous relief that this had happened. I think we were not wrong to be optimistic. We were probably wrong to be rosy-eyed or rosy-spectacled in how we thought that this was going to evolve. And probably we were rosy-spectacled, especially about how Russia was going to evolve after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'd say, of course, a second reason why we were optimistic, understandably, but maybe didn't have foresight, is that the rise of China that was happening beginning at the same time, that we'd seen with Tiananmen Square, a certain crisis in China, but then the rise of China was really the dominant story of the 1990s and 2000s, and probably we underestimated in our thinking the geopolitical significance of that.
Right.
We could see the economic significance of it quite easily because you have data for it constantly and you're either making profits or you're losing your business or something.
Exactly.
But geopolitically, it was probably harder to put it into a kind of sound framework. But now we've had a pretty rude awakening, of which, to me, the rudest awakening was the joint statement that the Russians and the Chinese did on February the 4th, 2022, 3 weeks before the Russian invasion, which essentially said in 5,000 words of text, we want to replace you. We want to get rid of your domination of the world.
And however, this was unexpected in a way. Nobody could believe what Putin would finally do.
No.
Oh, I mean, this is interesting because somehow I think we were too self-confident also in our Western value attitude and thought now we have done it. And we have this famous theory by Francis Fukuyama about the end of history and or the export of liberal democracy all over the world, the American dream, the Western dream, etc., etc. And then all of a sudden it didn't work. And I think the first sign on the wall was 9/11, of course, where we saw that there are other forces menacing this system of self-confidence and export of democracy. However, in a way, we expected that Russia would continue in its maybe reformist path after what happened in 1989, 1990, and this was, in the end, not the case.
I think we probably, if we had if we have a consensus view of Russia, it was either that it would go in a reformist path, although Boris Yeltsin used to drink rather a lot, and that made us, maybe that made us too complacent about where Russia was going to go, because it had an alcoholic as its president, and now when he was replaced by Vladimir
be the only
Putin,
one, of course.
No,
yes,
that's
but an
true.
important one. Yes,
but this was an important disguise. But I think perhaps if there was a consensus about Russia, it was that it was either going to come in this relatively benign, normalizing path, or it was going to be an always weak country. Upper Volta with rockets was the way it was sort of summarized a little, that it was going to be a declining economy. It was basically not important anymore. And indeed, in 2008, in the election campaign, I think it was, Barack Obama dismissed it as being just a regional power, not a superpower at all, just a regional power.
And they were highly offended when they heard that, because
that's right,
the
exactly.
Russians
Exactly.
are a very pride nation. And then the rise of Putin was still, at the beginning, everybody thought, okay, he and Medvedev, we can cope with them, and they have actually more or less a reasonable hand for their own country. Again, wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think quite a lot of people thought that that Putin in particular wasn't reasonable, but they thought that probably he couldn't do very much. I mean, this is an ex-KGB man. You wouldn't let him put his hand in your pocket or
But normally they act in cold blood now.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think we had there was plenty of warnings. I think we were pretty aware, but we just didn't think he really had the capability to do a lot. The other lesson in this recent period, as far as Russia is concerned, is that Putin wrote enormous, rather boring articles saying what he was going to do. But we didn't actually...
Nobody believed it.
...think that he thought it was the ravings of a madman. So we had, maybe if there was a mistake, we had an overly economically rational view of superpower behavior. The other cliche of the 1990s was Tom Friedman's view that two countries which each had a McDonald's in them would never go to war. Now, this is absurd when you think about it.
Absolutely.
But it was a kind of a way of thinking. So perhaps we became a little obsessed by, as it were, the idea that economic rationality meant that war would not happen. But that was true in 1912, 1913, 1914 as well, when famously in Britain, an English writer said, there can't be a war because it's not economically rational.
Well.
So I'm afraid not everyone...
Stupid, it's not the economy,
That's right, exactly. No, it's bad news for economists that the world doesn't work this way, but...
It's true, but sometimes it's also good because they always think it's only the only rule how the world works. So
well, that's right.
Maybe it was a healthier awakening, who knows. Speaking of you personally, how did you perceive the first Putin years? Were you skeptical? Did you know that he would invade Crimea and develop his whole system of kind of revitalizing Russian imperialism and all this kind of narratives as an amateur historian who wanted to go back to the old times of the Tsars or so?
I think my view, which was educated mainly by my colleagues at The Economist, who were much more expert on this, was that he was a danger, but mainly a danger to Russians, rather than a danger to me, if you like. I mean, to put it personally. I mean, I think his conduct in the war in Chechnya was clearly pretty brutal.
Extremely brutal already.
Extremely brutal.
Yeah.
He was clearly intimidating all sorts of neighbors, but again, it didn't seem like it would be likely to be carried through. He was intimidating the Baltic states from an early period. He was obviously intimidating Georgia over the provinces of South Ossetia and so on. So he was, a troublemaker, but I think he felt like he was not going to be a fundamental troublemaker. Now, many who have studied him would have disagreed with that. I had a particular person on my staff who lived in the Baltic states, who was convinced right from the start that there was going to be real trouble with this man, and that we were going to be in a so-called new Cold War with Russia. Now we keep talking about a new Cold War with China.
Absolutely.
But let's think about Russia.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Is there a starting point of the original sin of the faults of the West, that we weren't too strong or to face him with a kind of resistance when we saw that what he was planning? Should we have treated him differently from the beginning?
I think that that's almost a disrespectful view. I mean, I think he's had agency, he's had his right to do what he wanted to do, and he's done it. I don't think it makes any sense to me to blame the West. I mean, I'm a journalist. I've spent my career criticizing people. That's basically been my job. So I'm perfectly happy to criticize the West on this, that, or the other.
That's why we are liked by everybody, because we are doing this, no?
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, look, can you really say, as John Mearsheimer and others say, or Jeff Sachs these days, that, oh, if only we'd stopped the Baltic states joining NATO.
Exactly.
That this would have made the difference. I mean, really, this is not serious. No. This is not serious analysis.
But this view. Kind of NATO fairy tale still is alive.
It is
still used.
It
and
is.
People still believe it, especially people who defend Putin's motives.
Yeah, no, that's right. But I mean, if you look at what he writes, okay, he attacks NATO, but mainly what he writes is Ukraine is part of Russia. We should never have given it up, and I want it back. So, I mean, this is nothing to do with NATO. He thinks that, just as China thinks that about Taiwan.
Yeah, it's a little bit a different size, though.
Yeah, no, it's a slightly, and it's also somewhat different historical roots. But,
yeah.
I think, though, his fundamental issue is to do with the as it were, Russian Empire.
Yeah.
And restoring that, but also it's a weakened superpower with declining population, with an economy that's strong when the oil price is high and weak when the oil price is low, and he wants constantly to build his public opinion, and he's used nationalism and militarism as the tool.
A kind also of building an even stronger identity of the Russians themselves, you know. But this was always in history like this. In Germany, after the First World War, Hitler did more or less the same. And there was a journalist, a Russian journalist, writing in the German newspaper, The Welt. He says it reminds him highly on the developments of Germany from 1993 to 1945, that the people are fully supporting this kind of policy.
Yeah.
And this is kind of totalitarianism they somehow also cherish, I don't know, because it stabilizes their identity in a very difficult globalized world.
Yeah, that may well be right. I don't want to have put Russians on a psychologist's couch myself, but I mean, nevertheless, I can see the effectiveness of this combined with killing or locking up your opponents.
I think every nation has also a psychological side, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. So
think of the Swiss. I mean, we are almost perfect, and English, of course, too. But there are other nations different to perceive. So, what's your perception of the actual going-ons of the war in Ukraine? Is there any chance that Ukraine can turn the tide, or whatever you call it, for the next couple of months, or does it get more and more difficult?
No, I think that there is certainly a chance that Ukraine can turn the tide. Obviously, they need weapons. They absolutely need the equipment. Their main constraint is manpower, but that's not main constraint. The first constraint is weapons and ammunition, and the second constraint is manpower. Now, I think that the belated decision, many months late, of the US Congress to vote the bill through and get the weapons going will make a big difference. Now, in the next months, a key issue is going to be about further European support, I think, in terms of weapon systems and defense systems. So that's got to come, and I think we are seeing, particularly Poland and some other countries, getting somewhat more serious about
They're
supporting.
Amazingly courageous, I have to say. I mean, the Poles, respect to them. But on the other hand, United States, Germany also, do not want deliver certain weapons or allow the Ukrainians to use weapons beyond their own frontier, which makes a big difference in fighting the Russians back. So could that decision in the near future change?
Yes, I think it can. I'm not so sure whether the Germans will change on that, but I think the Americans are changing and will change on that. It makes absolutely no real sense militarily to hand over weapons and then not allow the your partner to use them against a country that's attacking them from inside its own borders. So it really makes no rational sense. And
does it make political sense?
I actually don't think it does, really. I think this risk, the perceived risk of escalation, is a myth. And I think the Americans are distanced enough from it and have enough unity within which at least this current establishment that they will come to that view. I don't feel as confident about the Germans because of the way in which particularly the Chancellor Scholz's party has been so divided over this issue to do with supporting Ukraine and policy to Russia.
Absolutely.
But I do think that'll turn. Let's be a bit optimistic about it. The Ukraine has defeated the Black Sea fleet of Russia in the Black Sea
quite quickly
without having a navy.
Which
has been a remarkable achievement.
Absolutely.
Has restored grain exports as a result, which is of great benefit to their economy. And even though Russia has been making ground, it's really only made 10 kilometers in the last last few months. It's not substantial, and that's without having the proper weapons.
Absolutely.
So I do think that that we should not be too pessimistic about it. I think it's possible, and perhaps the worst attitude is to say it's hopeless and that they have to negotiate because that is terrible for their morale, but also and for their recruitment, but also becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
But would Putin really accept that? Under which conditions would he push the button?
For what? Push the button for?
Nuclear.
Nuclear?
Yeah.
I don't think he will.
Never? Under no condition?
Well, it would be foolish to say never.
Of course.
But the fact is that he knows that if he uses a nuclear weapon, two things happen. One is that he gets a massive response directly from NATO. Whether it's conventional or nuclear, I can't predict. And I don't think probably there's a clear decision about what it would be. But there would be a massive response because any US president and all of the NATO leaders in Europe would feel absolutely obliged to do so. So he knows they'll get that massive response. The second, which perhaps is less important, is that the Chinese will be extremely angry with him if he uses a nuclear weapon.
Yes.
So I cannot see even what so-called tactical nuclear weapon. I cannot see any point from Putin's point of view. It's almost a suicidal act if he was to do that. So I don't think that's a serious problem. He could use conventional forces to seek to punish other Western countries.
Yeah.
I can understand that, or conventional and cyber.
I would try that.
But I don't think he'll use nuclear.
Cyber he already does all the time.
Yeah, he's already doing that all the time. So I don't think...
Constantly.
I think we shouldn't overrate the strength of Russia in this circumstance.
Also militarily, that was proven till now.
It's been proven, yeah.
How do you see the position, also the military position of the Nordic states? I mean, there was an amazing shift from neutrality of Sweden now into joining NATO, also rather really unexpected. And now they have a new self-confidence. This is very important also on the north. How do you see them?
Well, I think that they have, for understandable but also very realistic reasons, understood the way the wind has blown and the significance for them around the Baltic Sea and more or less on the front line. They feel closer to the Polish and Baltic states situation than somebody does in Spain, for example, or Italy.
It's really close.
It's really close, so that's number one. Number two, they've been pretty good at supplying weapons and ammunition. And I hope that continues. The big change that we want to see is greater military spending and provision of such material by more other European countries, including France, actually.
Yeah.
Quite critically. So
France
that's
has
a
quite
key
a problem
question.
with the weapon systems. I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
France is
Exactly.
really underarmed, absolutely.
Exactly.
And
So-
it's not a compensation if Macron
So
starts great rhetoric what we should do, but whoever this we is, and actually there's not much to be expected from that. But however, I mean, another aspect, is there any chance that Russia itself could turn again a little bit closer to what I would call civilized manners?
no,
No.
we're not under these leaders. No, we should not expect that.
For the next 20, 30?
Oh, well, I don't know. I mean, obviously everything depends on Putin and how he survives. Who would succeed Putin if, let's say, his bodyguard shot him, or if he gets overthrown? That is also unpredictable. The right working assumption is that he would be replaced by someone in his
Inner circle.
inner circle who is of a similar frame of mind, shall we say.
Or even more dangerous.
Well, I don't know if you can be more dangerous than him. In other words, what does that mean?
There are theories that there are really even badder guys there, but it's also interesting that he disposed of Shoigu, for instance, and others.
Yes.
So it's a kind of cleansing, and what will happen out of that?
But he's been pretty bad. I mean, he's been pretty bad. He's killed people on the streets of London using polonium. He's used a nerve agent in Britain.
Yeah.
He's attacked. He's killed people in his own country, obviously, but also he's invaded his neighbour with 150,000 troops, and now there are 300,000 there. So I don't take seriously the idea that the future will be worse. What I'm saying is that I don't expect it to be better.
Right.
It could be, but I don't expect it to be. But let's be a bit more optimistic. I think we've absolutely done the right thing in defending against him and pushing him back. It's true in the response to it, and I've had to start citing this Latin phrase that I never thought I'd remember again from school days, se vis pacem
Parabellum.
parabellum.
Right.
If you want peace, prepare for war.
Yeah.
So I think that is definitely a mood of our times that we have to convince more and more people of.
Yeah, but it took us a really hard lesson to learn that, I have to say.
Absolutely.
I remember we had Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann at the SIAF for a brilliant conference, and she also mentioned that, and of course she's a fierce defender of being strong against this kind of totalitarianism, and she also quoted the Latin saying, but if we look just only a little bit back, we see that it was absolutely not in the view or in the thinking of European leadership.
No, it's not. But things can change and are changing. I mean, let's look at the other side of the world. Japan is suddenly increasing its defense spending by 60%, and suddenly re-emerging as a military power. I mean, it always was to some extent. My friends in the British forces don't like me to point out that the Japanese Navy is double the size of the British Royal Navy.
That's almost an offense. No?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, that is true. And the Japanese are taking this very seriously because they see China and North Korea breathing down their neck. I think you can see other countries in the region, the Philippines particularly is getting very serious about it. Korea is getting more serious. So there's a clear and present danger from China. In Europe, now my Italian friends, where I was last week, they are still at 1.5% of GDP on defense. They're
Not so bad for Italy.
They're rather reluctant, but also they have a very large debt. Persuading them will be a bit harder, but I keep pointing out that they do have a pretty large defense industry, and maybe they would profit if there was greater European spending on defense. Leonardo's share price would go like this.
We know in this audience that this is already taking place.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, so in one point, Trump was right when he said, you should spend at least 2% of
Sure.
And everybody said, at that time, everybody said, come on, it's not true, it's not necessary, we are perfectly well equipped. And then you see a year later or so, the General Inspector of the Bundeswehr said, the German army is blank.
Yeah, no, that's right. And Trump wasn't the first to say that. You know, it's been going on through many US presidents. But it takes a real situation to change the perception.
And to wake up.
And to wake up, yeah, exactly.
Especially for Germany, because of all of the traditions, etc. And I have to say, at least from my perspective on, Angela Merkel made huge mistakes in many fields. But
yes.
Anyway, so let's shift a little bit to Asia, China. This is also very somehow frightening, but they do it in a much better way than Putin till now. They are silent, they do their connections, they have their systems, they buy large parts of European industries or whatever, and still cannot refrain from saying, we want to conquer Taiwan. Why is Taiwan so extremely important for them? Because, I mean, 10, 15 years ago, before Xi Jinping, it was not really a topic, or was it? Was it always a topic?
It was always a topic. It was a topic when Nixon and Kissinger went to China in 1972. So it's always a topic. At one point, now I am a nerd about this now, I should warn you, because I've just been writing a short book about deterrence, diplomacy, and the risk of conflict over Taiwan for my think tank, which in the Japanese edition will be called How to Stop World War III, by the way, the title.
That's a good title.
So that's the more catchy title.
It's a good title.
So I'm a bit of a nerd about this, but I mean, Taiwan is important strategically because its position is right in the center of the world's busiest shipping lanes. It's about control of the whole of the region. So called inside what's called the First Island Chain. So that's why it's particularly important. There's a psychological importance, which is about history, which is not really about ancient history. It's about modern history, about the fact that Japan took Taiwan as its first colony when it defeated China in 1895, and that Taiwan was then the base for the defeated Chiang Kai-shek.
Right.
So it's like two unfinished wars from the Chinese political point of view are sitting there in Taiwan, and they would like psychologically to finish those wars. But if you said, why would it justify costing huge amounts of Chinese lives to go and win this? The real answer is the strategic one, the maritime control of that whole region, which would also then...
And it matters really for them.
Well, that's harder to evaluate. You know, in a open global, an open trading system, sea lanes are, you know, after everyone under control. But I think if you're a major continental power like China, the instinct to control your borders, your region, the region around you is very strong. And so I think other things equal, they would like to do that. But what they know is that other things are not equal. Number one, there is Taiwan, which is a flourishing democracy and will defend itself.
They will defend itself very strongly.
But secondly, they know that the Americans, and now the Japanese and the Philippines and the Australians, are there to also make it much harder for them.
Couldn't accept it, actually, no?
And I think couldn't accept it. Biden has said 4 times that he would fight to defend Taiwan during his presidency. And I think that means that from a Chinese point of view, you've got to be willing to accept the likelihood that an invasion of Taiwan means full-scale war with the United States.
Which they couldn't win for the time being.
People vary about that, but it would seem to me that they couldn't. But secondly, why would you rule out the use of nuclear weapons in such a conflict when the stakes are so high? So this is the Cuban Missile Crisis of our time.
I think so?
In my view, yeah.
Okay. And what's your prediction for the next years?
About Taiwan?
Yeah.
I think my prediction is depending. I mean, as on many aspects, I have some worries about Trump. But if you leave Trump to one side, which unfortunately we can't, which I'd like to be able to,
not really
but I can't.
yet.
If we left Trump a bit to one side, I would say that it is likely that there will be a common understanding reached that the consequences of such a conflict are so catastrophic that it's inconceivable that either side could start it, like Cuba, really. The danger comes either if China is provoked into it by a Taiwanese declaration of independence.
Could that be?
Not from a Taiwanese point of view, but it's Trump. That's where I worry about Trump.
So he would influence them?
Well, he could influence, or indeed he could declare himself in favor of it, in thinking that this would provoke, not that it would push the Chinese back in some way. It's a slightly crazy thing he might do. Mike Pompeo, who was his Secretary of State, made a speech 2 years ago in Taipei declaring that this should happen, that America should recognize Taiwan as an independent country, as a sovereign state, and Pompeo is a possible Secretary of State or head of the CIA under a new Trump administration, should there be one.
He will put on the list again.
So I'm not saying that this is likely to happen, but that it could happen is what makes me worried about the stability of the situation. So if we look at the Cold War, what was characteristic after the Cuban Missile Crisis and this bipolar was that there was a consistency on both sides about how they understood at least the extreme possibilities of war.
And consequences.
Yes.
And
a consistency, broadly speaking, about policy from both sides towards each other.
Absolutely.
And we have to get back to that with China.
Yeah.
Or we have to reproduce that with China, I think.
To get a mindset established that it does not make sense at all. I mean,
that's right. That's right.
Well,
that's right.
Besides, I mean, for world economy, it would be the absolute catastrophe.
Yeah, I mean, as an economist, I have to admit that the economic consequences are the least important, but nevertheless, they're substantial. Now, let's be a little positive about what's going on.
Okay, it's good that you always defend the positive side.
In that region, just because I think that one of the problems in the way that we think about the world is that we often we act as if there are only a few countries really that matter. Particularly if you're American, you think that America and one other is always what matters.
Of course.
It was America and Japan in the 1980s, now it's America and China. These are the only two countries in the world. But what's happening is that the world economy is, the centers of power are diffusing, getting more wide. In Asia, for the first time in 4 decades, China is growing more slowly than its neighbors. The countries around China, Indonesia, India, Malaysia, Vietnam, are growing faster than China, because China's slowed down a lot and its population is shrinking and so forth. So, and people say, is this the end of globalization? To which my answer is, the clue is in the name. Globalization is global. It's not about two countries that may bring measures against each other. It's about many countries. So what's happening is that the supply chains in Asia are becoming much more diversified.
Absolutely.
Hence the growth of Indonesia.
Right.
Hence some of the benefit for India. Hence Malaysia. And so actually out of that conflict, there are some opportunities and benefits.
So what's the conclusion of your new book? The recipe.
The recipe for keeping peace is a strong deterrence, but also the creation of an arms control framework between the US and China on the lesson of the Cold War with the US and Russia.
And talk with each other again on a maybe more a little bit diplomatic way.
Yeah.
I know.
But that has to be about the important issues. I mean, I think one of the mistaken views in the diplomacy between US and China is to think that things will be good as long as we can talk to each other about climate change, or we can talk to each other about third world poverty or something else. that means that we're choosing not to talk about the things that are the dangerous things, which are about nuclear missiles.
Exactly.
And about Taiwan, and that sort of thing. And so we've got to force each other to actually talk about those issues.
That's the entrance door for the next steps.
Yeah.
If it works.
It's obviously extremely difficult, but the last formal communique between the US and China about Taiwan was in 1982 or something like that. So it's been a while.
Speaking of Trump, I mean, he always was unpredictable. However, under these 4 years, he didn't, I would say, produce a global catastrophe. And he always is proud to be the greatest steel maker in the world. So would it really that bad in the relationship between the United States and China if he became president?
I think, no. I think in terms of the US-China relationship, my guess is that the Chinese would prefer Biden simply because he's more predictable and they've worked out where he stands. I think with Trump, they would find him, they would be unsettled by his unpredictability, which is my point about Taiwan, really. Was it good or bad that he received what he called beautiful letters from Kim Jong-un in North Korea, that he went to his negotiations on a one-to-one basis with North Korea?
The little rocket man.
Yes, exactly, which ended nowhere, and very much alarmed his advisor, John Bolton.
He's a hardliner.
Who's a complete hardliner. I don't think it was necessarily a catastrophe that he did that, but certainly a lot of people in the region were very disturbed by that. No, I think the two reasons I worry about Donald Trump being re-elected in November are, number one, US democracy and the rule of law, where I think he's a very considerable danger to both of those. And secondly, a trade war.
Right.
He wants to put a 10% tariff on all imports from everywhere. How would we respond? I think it will be a tit-for-tat trade war.
Right.
Europe and Japan will have to respond, in my view, so that therefore there's an escalating set of higher prices and obstacles to trade. So those are the two reasons I worry about Donald Trump.
In a recent issue of the Economist, there was a title page. It was the title story of the possibility, or the question at least, of a new Caesarism in America. Is there any real chance that this almost worst case scenario could happen?
Yes, there is. I mean, rather back to your comment, that we all have some evil in us.
Right.
I think that Americans are perfectly capable of having that authoritarian direction. I'm not saying it's inevitable or anything like that, but I don't think that we should rule that out. Secondly, although the Constitution held up from his first term, and the rule of law held up more or less during his first term, he's learned a lot more about how to attack that.
Yeah.
And we can see with some of these episodes to do with Supreme Court justices and their political sympathies,
right,
that there's quite possible that the judicial system could be turned to his advantage. Now, let's not kid ourselves that this is totally new. Henry Kissinger famously said, which we all read in his obituaries, he said, the illegal we'll do quickly, the unconstitutional takes time. So it's not absolutely new, but I do think that a Trump presidency would be a big danger for some of these institutions of America, which we admire from afar, even if we feel slightly shaky about them as we look at them.
It's true. On the other side, I mean, Joe Biden is also not really a fantastic hope, no?
What do you mean, because he's old?
Not only old.
What else is wrong with him?
Addition, I would say, if you look at him, if he talks and so, you think he's firm in his position?
Well, look, there are two things that, I mean, the main thing about Joe Biden is that he should not be running for president at the age of 82.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, I'm sure that's absolutely right. In terms of many of his characteristics, he's been like that for the past 50 years.
50 years?
Yeah, throughout his time in politics. In other words, he's said slightly strange things, he's made gaffes. I remember Barack Obama, when they came into office, joking that Obama had to learn how to speak without a teleprompter, whereas he needed to train Joe Biden to speak with a teleprompter in order to control what he was saying. So, I mean, he's always been like that. But, there's no doubt that he should not be running for office at this age. But then neither should Donald Trump.
Of course.
At the age of 78.
Don't they have better candidates?
Well, I agree. I would like it.
That's incredible.
I would be delighted if Joe Biden announced sometime in the next few weeks that he was, after all, not going to run.
Who would be the replacement?
I can't be sure who it would be, but there are a number of candidates. I mean, the key question
who would be the best one?
I think Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan probably would be top of my list. Gavin Newsom is another possibility, but he has the big disadvantage of being from California. And there are others, Shapiro and others. But the big question is whether the Democratic Party would unite behind the next candidate. Yeah. So the uncertainty is that. But if you got a candidate who they had a fairly united party behind, who was, let's say, at a guess, 25 to 30 years younger than the alternative, my strong bet is that they would win by a landslide.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So they should do it.
Yeah, I think
Joe should do it, actually, because
I think Joe should do it.
To do it.
I think Joe should do it. The likelihood of him taking our advice seems to me to be quite low, but nevertheless.
Yes, indeed. Okay, switch to the Middle East. Catastrophic, horrific. How should that ever be solved?
It's impossible to say how it can be solved, but it cannot. I can say what it cannot be solved without, which is that I think it cannot be solved without the involvement of the surrounding countries, by which I mean Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, so forth.
Right.
So if there is to be a sustainable solution, it will need to be something that involves them and therefore has followed a process with which they feel still comfortable enough to be involved.
They would be ready somehow.
Yes, yeah. How you get from here to there is not a subject which is easy to provide an answer on. But what's been interesting to me about the way in which those frontline countries have behaved during the whole thing is that they've been less vocal and less obviously hostile than I would have expected.
Against Israel.
Against Israel, I mean, yes. And against the United States, therefore.
Yes.
They've actually been quieter than I would have predicted, given what's happened.
Right.
And so I think that probably there's a realization that it's in their interest to try to stabilize this. After one reason why they're quiet is because Iran is on the other side of this. So Iran is their enemy, or their threat. So that's a large reason why. So that's going to be the path to some sort of stability. But how we get there, I can't tell you that.
I mean, you have Hamas, you have Hezbollah, you have the Houthis, you have Iran. I mean, this is really a group of deeply evil forces, and they are still strong. Also Iran. I mean, for instance, now this president has been killed by a helicopter crash, technically, or whatever it was. I don't think it changes anything for the time being within the system, no? Or how do you see that?
I don't think so. I'm not an expert on Iran, but the key question is what happens when the supreme leader goes. Khamenei, yes.
Yes.
These presidents, and this man was one of the candidates to succeed him as supreme leader, and so that moves him out of the way. But that will be the key indicator as to how they manage that transition. The president is a less important figure.
Absolutely.
But Iran is clearly is a pretty fragile, if you like, society, but unfortunately with a rather strong military, and therefore the ability to keep a lid on.
And a strong police.
And yes,
very strong
exactly,
police.
yeah, exactly.
Revolutionary guards, and
Yes.
So there's also there little or almost no hope that the regime will change from within.
Yeah.
Even if we had this very courageous protests of the women who are treated
Well, that's right.
in an absolutely horrible way there. I mean, this is scandalous. This is Stone Age.
Yes.
A Stone Age country. But obviously still more or less in power. And the other thing is, what is also scary, how strong now we can see the waves of anti-Semitism grow all over the world. I mean, not only there in the Middle East, but in America, in Europe, you can see protests. I was 3 days ago in Paris at the Collège de France, and I watched huge groups of protesters with their flags and their songs, and so from the river to the sea. By the way, if you ask them which river they mean, they don't know what they say, and the sea also not, so they are also really not educated, but it is a very strong, emotional and aggressive attitude towards Israel, and beyond Israel, all the Jews. I mean, are we really back in times around from 1933 on? What do you think? Or will it collapse in the end after a couple of months or years?
I think it will collapse, but I mean, it's obviously an unpleasant and uncomfortable period. Perhaps I shouldn't turn it into a joke, but I will put one comment about it, which is now I'm an Englishman living in Ireland.
Yeah.
And there's a very strongly pro-Palestinian attitude in Ireland. I've come to realize that actually a lot of that is because essentially Irish people blame me, or rather the English, for everything that's happened in the Middle East. So that it's in a way a legacy of the colonial history of Ireland.
Right.
But I mean, more seriously, obviously it is a dangerous and unpleasant development. What has happened in our societies as a result of what's going on there. Now, this is also pretty dangerous for Joe Biden's re-election.
Exactly.
Not because the alternative would be different in their sympathy for Israel, but rather because it reflects negatively on his control of a situation and of the clarity and strength of his policy.
And of the people who could elect him or not elect him, of course.
Yes,
is also,
exactly.
Absolutely, but still, I mean, it's really also, I mean, the notion of a Palestinian state, if you look who could somehow be responsible for that in a good way. Hamas, in no way, this is out of control, and also totally crazy mindset, but Abbas is corrupt now for 30, 40 years. They don't have leaders who really are ready mentally and politically to represent a Palestinian state. So how should that even work? And
well, you can't magic into existence. I think that's right. I mean, that is why the support and input of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the Gulf state is so important. Now, the Palestinian Authority is the way it is, in part because of the situation that it's been managing,
right,
in which the flow of foreign money has been almost the only reality, and creaming off part of that, I'm afraid, is an unpleasant human instinct.
Absolutely.
So we don't know how they would evolve if they were in a different circumstance, but getting from here to there is obviously rather difficult. And it won't happen without the Saudis and the others being involved and taking some responsibility for it.
And they have some reasons to do that.
Yes.
Yeah, we have to be somehow even there optimistic, even if it's very, very difficult, and also sad what you see, kind of aggressions on the campuses in America, in Germany, and Berlin, for instance, especially. And of course, we understand the Jews and the Israelis, that they see that their whole existence is somehow in question, or even worse, like it was the Hamas Charter, etc., etc. So, okay, Maybe a last question about...
Should we get anyone from the audience? Maybe we should be...
Just one last here, and then we go to you, ladies and gentlemen. Tell me about your perception of the current policy of Switzerland.
Which current policy?
Exactly, this is already the answer. No, I mean, like the notion of neutrality.
Right, okay, yeah. Well, yes, no, and I live in a country, I mean, Ireland has also got a notion of neutrality, although since it's part of the European Union, it's kind of even more mixed than the Swiss notion of neutrality.
Can also be more toxic even, actually.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, I don't approve of the decisions about blocking the transfer of weapons and ammunition. I think that's...
Does not make sense.
It doesn't make sense, and it hasn't been good for Switzerland's reputation.
You see?
I think that's right.
Yeah, let's hope that we will change that. And besides, also the total neutrality is also somehow a fiction or a myth, because we never could defend ourselves with weapons, only referring to ourselves and our means, that especially if you can fire a rocket from Pyongyang to Switzerland. It's not like in the Second World War when the Swiss were looking at the Germans over the River Rhine and thought maybe they come or not, and we have our bunkers. It's totally different, but this is another topic, of course. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours. Now, please ask your questions. Manny Riebach has the first question.
Thank you for being with us. Just to expand on that last question, what advice do you have, if any, for small, open economies or countries on how to best to navigate the current challenging geopolitical environment that you outlined? Thank you.
That's a pretty general, a difficult question, but I mean, I think mostly Switzerland is a model in how to navigate these issues, rather as in its own place, Singapore is quite a model for that, where it is neutral but actually pretty participant with all of the major powers around it. And I think maybe the best advice is to take a very open approach, but also then not be restrictive in the way in which you transact with the parties involved. And then you have to decide what your values are, and that's not something that I should advise.
Next question, please. Yes.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about Japan, because I know that you spent some time there, and you've mentioned it in passing. How does the Japanese view, or how has the Japanese view on the region evolved in the last 10, 15 years? What is the Japanese thinking on what's going on in broadly the Asia-Pacific region, and how would you expect Japan to sort of develop its policies over the next few years? I know it's a very broad question, so you can pick a direction that you want this to go into.
It's fine. I mean, a nice Japanese way of describing this is to say, you know, there's a saying in Australia that they suffer from the tyranny of distance. We Japanese, we suffer from the tyranny of proximity, that we are doomed to be right next door to North Korea and right next door to China, and therefore the Japanese have seen with both of those powers becoming more dangerous. North Korea because of its nuclear weapons and its missile capability, China because of its actions in the South China Sea and because of its potential threat to Taiwan. The nearest island to Taiwan Japanese island is 150 kilometers, so it's very close. So the Japanese absolutely over the last 10 years have seen a rising threat in the region. And so the recent Zeitenwende in Japan on defense is really the culmination of 10 years plus of a change in approach and thinking under constitutional constraints, which is why it's slowed down. And so the Japanese very much see a threat to themselves, physically and commercially and politically. On the other side of that, they've depended on the United States for the last 75 years for their defense, and they see the United States as an important but not necessarily dependable partner. So they realize they need to build up some options over the very long term to defend themselves in defense. So that's the easiest way to answer your question, I think.
Okay, we have a question from the internet. It has a philosophical background even. Mr. Emmott, I was surprised that your liberal interlocutor, it's possibly me, remained calm when you said that living under an empire has historically been the norm. Is that because liberal paternalism won and has been working towards this ultimate victory for 200 years?
I think that I was misheard if it was thought that I said that. I said that great power competition was the historical norm.
Yeah.
That we are back to what has been throughout history being the normal situation of powers jockeying for position, fighting for leadership, for dominance and others. So that's what I meant. I don't think living under an empire is the norm. Whatever Britain's history might suggest as far as its recent empire is concerned, I don't think that that's the norm.
Of course, but however, if you look back in history, I mean, there was plenty of empires,
yes,
and only really a few democracies like Switzerland and then America, and of course we were the first because we killed all the Austrians. But anyway, empires were more or less, maybe we wouldn't call it the norm, but it was reality. Okay, next question here, please. Yes.
Could you say something about Africa?
We have a microphone.
Could you say something about Africa? What role will Africa play in the future? We all know that China, Russia is very present there, and it seems that Europe and the United States much less. How quickly will Africa evolve, and how much will this influence the future?
Well, I think, look, Africa's 50 plus countries, and so the answer to that is pretty varied. But Africa is important for the demography. Clearly, Africa is the continent of the world that's got the fastest population growth currently. And so Africa is going to become much bigger in the foreseeable future. It's much later in achieving a transition to smaller families than the other regions of the world. So it's a force for migration, but it has also had its best period of economic growth over the past 15, 20 years in its history, but at least in its post-colonial history. So there is development underway in Africa. I have to think as an economist especially that there is an optimistic future for a lot of African economies, but never all. But those that can master the education system and that can establish a rule of law have a terrific opportunity in participating in the global economy in a very active way beyond simply shipping of commodities. The recent agreement to an African free trade area involving quite a lot of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa was a big step forward. Africa is the region of the world with the least intra-regional trade compared with Europe and the Americas and Asia. Africa's got a lot of development to come from trade within itself. So I mean, I think there's reasonable grounds for being optimistic about the future development of Africa. How the demography then interacts with that and so forth, it's very hard to say. And clearly, from our point of view in Europe, Africa is going to be important as a source of migration for as long as we can imagine. But I think economically, it's pretty important. Is it true that somehow Europe and America is behind in Africa? I'm not sure that it is true particularly. Whereas we certainly no longer call the shots. We're certainly no longer the main telephone number to call if you need a loan or a bridge built. But it's good for Africa that they've had a lot of other sources. The people in Africa that worry me are the Russians, because they're principally mercenary military forces, whereas I'm not that worried about China in Africa. They're building bridges and airports and so forth, and they can't take the bridges home with them. So actually they've found pretty quickly that lending money is pretty awkward when people you lend it to can't pay it back. And I think that they're going through a phase of maturing in their relationship with some of their like clients within Africa and other continents. So I wouldn't be that worried about China in Africa, but I'm much more worried about the Wagner Group and all of those Russian mercenaries who are, fighting wars in exchange for mining rights.
Walter Kielholz.
I would like to take the discussion back to Japan, Germany. What would you say if I would argue there are a lot of people who are a little bit frightened about a militarized Japan and a militarized Germany again? So should we be careful what we wish for? I think we should not forget where Japan, for example, came from, and how Japanese military and Japanese dominance of Asia was seen only a few years ago. And how do people feel in Eastern Europe about the militarized Germany? So I sometimes just don't know whether we are too forgettable about the history. And sometimes you can also say maybe a cautious government in Berlin and a cautious government in Tokyo is not so bad.
No, but let me talk about Japan, which I know much better than Germany from this point of view. I think that it's definitely true that there are certain people in Southeast Asia who worry about this. Tomorrow I will fly to Singapore to the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is run by this International Institute for Strategic Studies that I chair the board of. And at the end of last year's Shangri-La Dialogue, the Singaporean defense minister shocked all the Japanese in the room by suddenly giving a warning saying, as you build up your weaponry, you better explain to us why you're doing it properly, because otherwise, there'll be trouble. And so it was exactly the point you make. So I do think that there's a big diplomatic task that they have to do. Now, with most countries in Southeast Asia, they've done that quite well. Diplomacy plus money, in other words, investment, infrastructure investment and so forth. And they're much more influential diplomatically in Southeast Asia than the United States is, because they know the region, because they bring money as well, and they're open to trade. But they do have to communicate the purposes and so forth of their militarization better, I think, if they are to manage this situation. Germany, yeah, I think that's harder for me. Maybe that's harder for me to comment on. But I think there's clearly some concern. But when the Polish foreign minister said, I'm more worried about a too timid Germany than a newly militarized Germany, I took him seriously. I think that he's probably right that he thinks that there should be a bit more than they are.
But he also has changed his mind over the last years. And
yes.
I mean, Rado, we talk about Rado Sikorski.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it is, I would say, but of course there is a psychological argument and not to be neglected, however, if we see the strength of the Bundeswehr in the last 30 years, we really don't have to worry, even more have to be pity about how they did what they obviously had to do. I have a question here again. History has shown that wars are won by the parties with most resources. Russia's GDP 2024, roughly 2 trillion. This half of Germany's GDP, 4.2 trillion, 1/8 of European Union's GDP, 16 trillion, and less than 5% of NATO, 45 trillion. And now it comes. How can Putin hope to win any conflict with NATO, Europe, the West?
Well, I think that his main hope is to avoid such a conflict, which is why I don't worry I'm less worried about the escalation question than some, because I think that if Putin really seriously were to escalate into a conflict with the West in a direct way, he would then be up against a much more powerfully resourced set of countries if they were really willing to deploy their resources. So his best hope all along has been to persuade them not to.
Yeah, he tries.
And to try to keep it down, because otherwise the imbalance is clear.
Absolutely. Another question here on the internet. Isn't a good part of anti-Semitism coming from another problem area, people from Muslim countries who take this issue to the countries where they live now? So what about this part of the world?
Well, I don't know how to evaluate that. There's no doubt that anti-Semitism is obviously, that enmity is shared. I mean, is there with many Muslim communities. There's no doubt that that's true. I don't think it's the principal source in European countries of the rise of anti-Semitism, but I think it's a contributing element. But
or enforcing it.
Yeah. But if those Muslim communities weren't there, we would still be facing up to this issue, I would say.
But of course it is also a factor in parallel societies, as they have in Germany especially, and there is a strong force of anti-Semitism there.
But it goes both ways. I mean, in the United Kingdom, some of the campaigns of the far right have been against our Muslim mayor of London, for example.
Absolutely.
Claiming that he's turning London into a set of Sharia, law zones and so on and so forth. Just fake news, but I'm afraid it's part of the world we live in.
That's true, but if you look at Berlin's demonstrators, as they want to promote a caliphate, 1,000, 2,000 regularly coming out. I find this is still scaring. I mean, the last European caliph was Napoleon, but this is a long time ago. We have to think about that.
Yes.
It's interesting. Okay, there would be a lot of other questions here also on the internet, which is a very good sign for our discussion, and a compliment, of course, to our distinguished guest. Maybe this one. President Macron is showing muscles to Putin. Do you think this is the right approach when facing today's situation?
I wish he'd done it 2 years ago.
Yeah, he comes a little bit late.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, I think, and the question with Macron seems to be whether there's substance there.
Words.
He's rather prone to produce showy statements rather than actions, I have to say.
He does it in a brilliant way.
Yes.
We have to admit that, and this is, of course, l'école normale supérieure. But the consequences are often a little bit different. Maybe the last question here, Uli Sick.
No, okay.
I have a question as to Taiwan. We faced the early phase of choking of Taiwan to surrender, and no shots fired, no rockets fired into Taiwan. Most likely no open invasion, just continuous choking, strangulation, which cleverly shifts the ball to everyone else who would oppose that. So my question is, who should do what in this particular situation?
I agree with you. This is the most likely form of coercive act from the Chinese on Taiwan, in my view. I agree with you, because it transfers the obligation somewhat to the opponents, and because it doesn't directly put at risk Chinese lives, and thirdly, well, the chances of a surprise attack on Taiwan are very low because you have to build up the forces, so therefore you don't have the alternative chance. Last year I went to the Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii for this piece of research I was doing, and asked them about the blockade, and their answer was, when I said, what's the plan if there's a blockade? And the deputy commander of the Indo-Pacific Fleet said to me, well, we do have a plan, but I would have to have you killed after I told you it. Then I went to Tokyo, and I went to see some people in the Japanese Navy, and maybe it was representative of the fact that they've been so, very quiet for so many decades. But when I asked this question to the Japanese vice admiral that I was speaking with, he said, easy, and he leapt out of his chair and went over to a map he had on his wall, and he said, if they blockade Taiwan, we're just going to blockade those parts, and we will put a squeeze on them. Now, would that be effective? It would be a tool, and it would, I think, happen depending on the number of countries around. So it would probably be an evolving situation. I actually think that if it became impossible to supply Taiwan, I suspect that the Americans would break the blockade militarily, and therefore would take the risk of provoking war. They would do so after making warnings. They would do so after seeking negotiations. But a blockade is a declaration of war in international law. It is, against international law, and I think they would do that. So I think that would be their plan. Counter-blockade first, supply second, and then challenging the blockade third. But what would be the outcome of it? That's a more complicated question.
The last question now.
You referenced migration in one of your responses, and I was thinking, do you think that climate change, the potential for mass migration and competition for resources, will present a greater threat than acts by individual governments or states as we look forward?
I wish I thought that. In other words, I actually think that, unfortunately, the acts by governments are more clear and present dangers and could have much more devastating consequences. So I'm afraid I would still put those acts higher than the impact of migration. Now, with fast population growth and in regions where there is lack of economic opportunity, and in some cases where you'll have climate reinforcing that, then that is clearly a big factor behind migration, and managing that process is extremely difficult, and will be a constant challenge over the next decades. So I don't wish to diminish it, but I think that issue is a constant policy headache. The other one is the source of catastrophe, and therefore I'm worried more about that catastrophe than I am about that migration, I think.
All right. Thank you very, very much, Bill. It was absolutely fabulous, stimulating, interesting, as always when you're here. And we are honored and pleased to have this discussion. A short summary, I would say we have solved about 99.9% of the world's problems, which is quite not bad for 1 hour, but we will still continue. And if the Swiss TV gives us an hour every month to discuss it and develop it further, we would be ready to do that too. Again, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. Thank you also to Swiss Re to host always this remarkable event, and we'll look forward to the fall semester. We are more or less ready to show you soon on the internet a program which will be again highly interesting on all channels. And in the meantime, we wish you a great summertime and stay healthy, and let's hope that the world won't fall apart. As you see, Bill is an optimist. I'm more or less too, a little bit less, and this is maybe the good mix to expect what will come. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.